Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at doubled pawns and in particular looking at when they can actually be a help to your position rather than a hindrance. So I'll be starting with the 3 disadvantages of playing with doubled pawns and then moving on to the 3 advantages of playing with double pawns. So make sure you stick around to the end to find out where doubled pawns can really help you out. And if you are new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and do leave me a comment down below to let me know what you'd like to see on future videos, and I'll look to get through as much as I can. So the position we've got here is a typical kind of king's pawn position where white now finds himself in some trouble because of this pin against the f3 knight. So we've got this bishop on g4 eyeing down to the queen, and once this knight jumps in from c6 to d4, it now doubles the pressure that's being exerted on this knight. And because the white squared bishop has moved outside of the pawn chain earlier in the game, that piece now can't get back to block the pin. And equally, white never played h3 to prevent this bishop coming out to g4. So it's white to play here. Probably the best is to play bishop e3 to try and challenge the scope of this black squared bishop cutting down to the king. And in response to this, black can now take knight takes on f3, and after pawn recaptures, black drops the bishop back. And we can see that we've got these pretty ugly doubled f-pawns in front of white's king. And the 3 reasons why these pawns aren't very good in this position, and this brings us on to the 3 disadvantages of playing with doubled pawns, is that 1, when you double a pawn, you leave a weak square somewhere else. So by moving this pawn from g2 to f3, we've left this h3 square unguarded. And so the black queen can now quickly swing out into the attack and make use of this potentially later in the game. Equally, a bishop could easily land on that square later in the game. We've also now reduced the mobility of these pawns. So when you've got the pawns together in more of a chain, if we imagine that this pawn was on, say, g3, for example, and obviously the white queen wouldn't be under attack, let's say that was on d2, then it would allow us to break with the f-pawn to f4 much more quickly. But because this pawn is on f3, not only does it block the f2 pawn behind it, but now the queen in this position has to sit and guard that pawn, or white would have to step up with the king to g2, but then he's opening himself up for king safety issues, because black could quickly break with f5 once the king moves out of the way of this line of the bishop, and then the rook is behind supporting that pawn break, and it could soon even swing in from f6 to g6, and then it's looking down at the white king. So this is one of the issues with pawn doubling as well, as you reduce the mobility of the pawns behind. And the third disadvantage of having doubled pawns is that these doubled pawns can become weak in endgames. So because we've broken this pawn chain, then you can't now support this f3 pawn with another pawn, so it constantly has to be looked after by other pieces or the king, and this distracts them from doing other jobs. However, doubled pawns aren't always bad, and now I want to look at the 3 advantages that they can give you in certain positions. So if we imagine here that white plays bishop to e3, challenging this strong black squared bishop on c5, and let's say that black exchanged the bishops here to give white the doubled pawns, white recaptures, and we should now assess this position. So without getting too detailed on whether bishop e3 was absolutely the best move in the position, if we just look purely at what white has achieved by doubling these pawns, the first thing we notice is that the rook now has a half open file looking down at this sensitive f7 point if the knights were to move off this file in the future. And so that's the first thing to say about doubled pawns, where there can be an advantage, is that the minute you double a pawn, you automatically open a file. And so this can be an advantage for your rooks if they're already on that file. The second advantage of doubling your pawns is that they can lend protection to key squares in the position. So here we can see that especially by capturing towards the centre here, we've now taken away this d4 outpost from the knight on c6, so it can no longer hop into this dangerous square. Now it has created a weakness on g3, so we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. The disadvantage mentioned earlier still stands, but we should also recognise that there's the advantage of protecting key squares when you double pawns. And the third thing to note about doubled pawns is that they can create a bit of a wall in certain parts of the board. So where you double a pawn, you create this kind of pawn fortress, and your pieces can then maneuver behind. If we imagine, for example, that black gets in the d5 break at a certain point in time, not right in this position because white would just win a pawn, but in the future if they arranged that break, then with the white pawns being tripled up like this in the centre, we would be able to take back with this pawn on e4, and then we still have a pawn in reserve ready to push into the centre and claim that central space. So by having that central fortress of pawns, we can then start manoeuvring our pieces round the back of these and playing in the other parts of the board. So that's our quick run through of doubled pawns. They can be disadvantages, yes, but there are also times when they are advantages. So make sure when you're assessing a position to determine whether the doubled pawns will be good or bad for you, you think about the 3 advantages they can create, the 3 disadvantages they can create, and then assess whether or not you're getting more of the advantage side of it rather than the disadvantage when you're looking to make that trade down. So as always, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to smash that like button if these videos are helping you, and do consider subscribing and leaving a comment down below if you want to see some future videos on a certain topic, and I'll look to get round to making those for you. So that's all for now, and I'll see you on the next video.